Good day. Today is Friday, 1st August 2025, and today we've had a whole succession of announcements from the United States, from Donald Trump, of the various tariffs that he's imposing on various different countries around the world. There is, I have to say, a sense of déjà vu about this. We went through the whole affair seemingly once before, Liberation Day back in March, and this appears to be a sort of rerun of all of that. I confess to a sense of exhaustion at the way in which this protracted affair is playing out over the last couple of weeks. There's lists of various different countries that have been hammered by various high rates of tariffs. Canada, I notice, is at 35%. Switzerland is at 39% tariffs. I wonder what exactly it is that the Swiss have done which have provoked this extraordinary reaction from President Trump and his team. Again, in many cases, I get the sense that a lot of this is being sorted out in sort of back of the envelope calculations, which aren't really calculations at all. And, well, we continue to get reports and claims about various trade deals that the Trump administration has supposedly agreed with various countries. But so far as I can tell, none of these trade deals so far have actually been reduced to writing. There hasn't been a single draft agreement or document or signed document yet prepared. I might be wrong here, but anyway, so it seems to me. And as I said, confusion exists with figures, again, as I said previously, plucked out of the air, which mean very little. Just to get a sense of how confusing the whole thing is, a couple of weeks ago, President Trump announced 50% tariffs against Brazil. And it all looked very serious and very alarming for Brazil. And it was couched with all sorts of threats from President Trump and his officials, condemning Brazil for its various actions, its various political actions, the prosecution of the former president, President Bolsonaro, the restrictions that have been placed on U.S. social media platforms, the fact that Brazil was supposedly running a trade surplus with the United States, whereas in truth it was running a deficit. But anyway, it all looked very impressive and very frightening and very menacing, even though, again, it was never really laid out in writing. But we now learn that that 50% tariff that was imposed on Brazil is not really a 50% tariff at all, because all sorts of items are exempted from it, including aircraft, business jets and such things that Brazil's Embraer Corporation produces and exports to the United States. I'm not going to pretend that I've got into the details of all of this. As I said, it sounds very confusing and chaotic. And again, one gets the sense that a lot of this is being worked out on the fly. Now, India has been hit with a 25% tariff. Donald Trump spoke about a penalty that he was going to impose on India for supposedly continuing to trade with Russia. But at the moment, that penalty has not been exacted. In the UN Security Council, in a debate that took place in the UN Security Council on what is taking place in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, a debate, by the way, which I believe was held at the request of Russia. Just saying. Anyway, at that debate, the US representative, who is not yet the US ambassador, the ambassador is supposed to be Mike Waltz, but I understand that he hasn't yet been confirmed by the Senate. Anyway, the US representative said that the United States President Trump were now expecting that there would be a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia on the 8th of August. An impossible deadline, just a week away, and one which is completely at variance with the realities on the ground. Anyway, President Trump has sort of threatened the Russians with sanctions on that day, though he continues to say, remarkably, that he doesn't expect the Russians to pay any attention to the sanctions or to be basically unduly worried about them, which, as I've said already, makes a complete nonsense of all of these decisions. But perhaps going back to India, we will see this penalty on India exacted on the 8th of August when the Russians refused to comply with Donald Trump's ceasefire demand. It is most extraordinary, very bizarre, that tariffs, higher tariffs, are being imposed on one country, India, because of actions taken by another country, Russia. And as I've discussed already, it's impossible to relate any of these tariffs, the ones that are being imposed in this whimsical way, to any economic program to protect American industry or to any revenue-raising program either, even though for the moment the tariffs are bringing in quite a lot of money, though nowhere near enough to cover the higher deficits that the United States is facing. Anyway, all of this, as I said, continues in the same old way. The Indians, incidentally, have been reporting that they're not going to be deterred or dismayed by these tariffs. They've pointed out that previously, during the previous era of BJP government, when India went outside the nuclear non-proliferation program and detonated nuclear devices, the United States imposed various sanctions upon India. The Indian economy brushed those off. The Indian economy continued to expand. The United States eventually reversed all those tariffs and sanctions, and the Indians seem confident that the United States is going to do the same thing. Now, I would say that it does seem that over the last week, India has in fact been buying and refining less Russian oil. I suspect that Indian refiners have been waiting to see what would happen and have been seeking guidance from the Indian government. But for the moment at least, I doubt that this will hold for very long. The Indian government, so far as I can tell, seems committed to buying Russian oil and deepening India's relationship with Russia. Now, there's been an interesting, curious development about this because I read another report, it might have been in Reuters, that one of the reasons why the relationship between Prime Minister Modi of India and President Trump has soured is that the United States, President Trump, offered to sell to India F-35 stealth fighter jets. Prime Minister Modi and his officials apparently considered the offer, but decided that they wouldn't go with it. They decided that they would source their fighter jets elsewhere. And apparently President Trump didn't take well to that at all. And though there's been no word that India does intend to source stealth fighter jets from Russia, in other words, buy Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter jets, clearly, judging from his Truth Social posts, that is his suspicion. That is what he believes. And apparently that enraged President Trump, and it was another factor in turning him against India and causing him to impose these tariffs. I find this again utterly extraordinary, completely mystifying behavior. The Russians, for the record, have been often disappointed by Indian decisions to buy aircraft and other equipment from Western states. About 10 years ago, the Russians tried to sell to India the MiG-35 fighter jet, an advanced development of the MiG-29, and they offered India help with producing this fighter jet in India and suggested that there would be a significant amount of technology sharing with India in relation to this fighter jet. The Indians turned it down and instead bought the French Rafale fighter jet, and the Russians were deeply disappointed. It is consistent with Indian policy, however, to diversify to the extent it can its arms buying. Anyway, the Russians were not happy. The decision by India not to buy the MiG-35 basically brought to an end the entire MiG-35 program. I'm not going to discuss the merits of the two fighter jets, which I am not qualified to do, but what I can remember is that though the Russians were disappointed, they didn't sulk and complain and impose tariffs on India or threaten the Indians with economic retaliation in the way that the United States, President Trump, is currently doing. Now, there's been a very interesting article by the analyst Andrew Karibka, who is suggesting that the actions that the United States is taking, that President Trump is taking, that all of these tariffs, that they have one particular underlying objective, which is to stop India's rise, to prevent India becoming another great power. The American objective presumably being to beat down whichever country already is a great power, China and Russia, and to prevent any other great power, such as India, emerging. And the premise behind all of this is that the United States really fundamentally does not like rival great powers, and what it sees India as is an ally, a subordinate ally, which the United States can play against China, but it doesn't want India to develop into a great power and to acquire a mind and a policy of its own. Well, it's an interesting theory, and I suspect that there is something to it, but I don't think one should push it too far. And the reason I say that is that though it is consistent with a general approach that the United States has been taking in international relations for quite a long time, my sense is that policy at the moment in Washington is being made far too chaotically to explain the 25% tariff that the United States has just imposed on India. I understand Karibko's point that preventing India buying Russian oil, preventing India sourcing Russian military technology does in some ways slow India's rise. If that could be achieved, and as I said, there may be some people in the intestines of the permanent state in the United States who really are thinking in this way. But I am not convinced that the president himself understands this quite in that fashion, and I don't think that this is really explains his decisions over the last couple of weeks. Now, two important countries for the moment are not being singled out in this latest flurry of tariffs that the president has announced. One is Russia and the other is China. Now, in the case of the Russians, it's not difficult to work out why. The president is presumably saving his ammunition until his deadline expires, which is on the 8th of August. He said that there will be sanctions against Russia on those days. He talks about how this is now all but inevitable. As I said, he says this with complete lack of belief and conviction. He seems to acknowledge that the Russians will simply ignore the sanctions, that the sanctions will not have much effect, but he's making it fairly clear that, as far as he can see, there is really no option politically in the United States other than to impose these sanctions. The other party, of course, is China. Now, China is subject to tariffs, 35% tariffs, or is it 50% tariffs? I'm not clear. And again, a lot of the tariffs are not really in force. So all sorts of things that the Chinese export to the United States, including electronic goods and some of these things, are not subject to tariffs and sanctions and all that at all. But anyway, the negotiations that took place in Stockholm have been inconclusive. The whole debate has been kicked down the road, apparently for another 90 days. The Chinese showed in the spring, in April and May, that they will not be kicked around, that they have all kinds of measures that they can use to retaliate against the United States. They stopped the exports of rare earths and magnets to the United States, and that created a crisis in the U.S. industrial system. The United States continues to be extremely heavily dependent upon China for all kinds of manufactured goods. The United States, President Trump, seemed to realize that China can't be pushed around in the way that some other countries can be. So for the moment, at least, the United States is holding back. The interesting question is what will happen on the 8th of August when the Russians refuse to comply with President Trump's threats. Will the president at that point move forward and impose secondary tariffs against China? And if so, in what amount? Even though the Chinese are certain to treat that as a violation of the agreements previously reached in Geneva and London, and as violating the spirit of the negotiations, the ongoing negotiations, including the ones that have just taken place in Stockholm, and all with the potential effect of catapulting the United States into another economic war with China, which the United States is not well positioned to win. So we will are going to have to wait and see. Listening and reading the things that the president has been saying, I get the sense that yes, he remains fully committed to his tariff policy. He is a true believer in tariffs. He generally believes in protection. Protection is widely believed in and supported by members of his MAGA electoral base in the Rust Belt communities, which voted for him. People there support tariffs and demand protection for their industries. So I think the president himself does genuinely believe in these policies. I also think that at some basic level, he does somehow believe, or has convinced himself, that countries around the world have indeed taken advantage of the United States, and that this is partly or mostly responsible for the decline in American manufacturing. He has here some glimmer of fact in his favor, but he doesn't, I think, fully acknowledge the extent to which the United States itself, or previous administrations in the United States, chose to open American markets to imports from around the world as part of the US's wider geostrategic strategies. This is something, of course, that goes back very far in the Cold War. The United States wanted to win over states around the world to persuade them not to align with the Soviet Union, and basically it bribed them onto the US's side, the West side, by opening its markets to their exporters. And this was something that happened in East Asia. It happened to a great extent in Europe as well. And it explains an awful lot of the policies that we have seen play out over the last decades. And it must be said, especially during the Cold War, it was overall a very successful geopolitical strategy. It did mean that the Soviet Union attracted far fewer allies around the world than it might otherwise have done, and it did ensure that the global economy essentially came under American control, and that all countries around the world that participated in the global economy were to a greater or lesser extent glued to the United States. So I understand some of what the president is saying, but I have to say that I find his sense of grievance about it, which no doubt reflects feelings in the Rust Belt, but his own sense of grievance, which seems real to me, frankly, a stretch. Anyway, we will see what happens on the 8th of August. Given that we're talking about Donald Trump, it's not impossible that he will become frustrated all over again by the fact that all of these leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, are not rushing to telephone him and to plead with him to relax his sanctions and things of that kind. It's entirely possible that at some point that will make him frustrated and angry, and that he will shorten his timetable again. But as I said, listening to him, I still get the sense that when it comes to Russia, he is doing something that he doesn't really believe in, and that at some level he understands is a mistake. How else to explain his comments that the sanctions that he's intending to impose against Russia are not going to make any difference? I can't help but feel that the president finds himself caught between a rock and a hard place. He finds that the Russians are completely implacable in pursuing their objectives in Ukraine. They set out their terms on the 14th of June 2024 in Putin's speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry. He is deeply frustrated by the fact that the Russians have not in any way walked back on those terms, that they're not agreeing to Kellogg's ideas of a freeze or anything like that. And he feels that he cannot agree to those terms, because were he to do so, it would be treated by his own supporters in the United States, not just by his own supporters, but by the neocon community in the United States and in Europe, as a capitulation to the Russians. And this frustration has made him angry, and he's expressed his anger against President Putin many times, and his anger has come to be reflected in some of his policy decisions. So that is one problem that he faces. He has the reality of Russian implacability. But I get the sense that he's also deeply frustrated and feels boxed in by the hardline stance being taken by the majority of members of the Senate. It does seem as if 80 out of the 100 senators support Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions. Lindsey Graham shows no willingness at all to ease off on that. In fact, he's been posting all sorts of gloating messages over the last couple of days about the enormous effect of the sanctions and tariffs that President Trump is already imposing. He's got himself involved in a bizarre and, in my opinion, ridiculous exchange with Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council. And I get the sense that he's not prepared to waver or modify his stance, which is backed by most of the Senate, demanding a hardline policy from Donald Trump towards Russia and towards countries that trade with Russia. And I think every attempt by Donald Trump to get Lindsey Graham to back off up to this point has failed. I think that Trump, as I've said already, miscalculated this. If he trolled Graham back in April to back off, if he'd spoken to the Republicans in the Senate at that time, when the Graham-Blumenthal bill was first mooted, then at that time, Republican senators would have retreated on it. Now it's too late, and as I said, I think he feels boxed in. He doesn't want this bill, which could tie down his hands, actually become law, and I think for that reason, he feels that he has to preempt the bill by imposing tariffs and sanctions on the Russians and on others of his own. So he is being maneuvered through his own miscalculations and his own anger and through the pressures that are being applied on him domestically into a policy which I suspect deep down he realizes is a mistake. Again, some people will say I am being too generous towards him. I think, on the contrary, I am being actually harsh towards him. A policy conducted of this nature, conducted in this way, without conviction, is a testimony to insecurity and weakness and poor management on the part of the president and his officials. It is not a sign of a strong leader who is firmly in control, pursuing a policy that he believes in and which he thinks will work in the interests of the United States. Anyway, there we are. That's what I think. Now, what is driving events and what I suspect is adding particular tension to these events is the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And I will return to that later, shortly, in this program, over the course of this program. But one gets a sense of how desperate some people, at least in the administration, are becoming, and the extent to which the president himself, I suspect, feels boxed in. Now, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has just disclosed that there was a meeting of some kind between the Russians and the Americans. It's not at all clear where this took place, who was involved, and at whose instigation. It's altogether mysterious. It looks as if this meeting was conducted, if not in complete secrecy, at least in semi-secrecy. But according to Rubio, This meeting happened, and its purpose was to see whether some kind of route could be found to try to reach some kind of peace settlement in Ukraine. I am going to guess that the meeting took place in Istanbul about 2 weeks ago, when the Russians and the Ukrainians met in Istanbul. I suspect that American officials met Medinsky and the other members of the Russian delegation and tried to talk them into making concessions which the Russians were not prepared to make to the Ukrainians. That's my guess. If I'm wrong, well, we'll no doubt find out in due course. But that's the only place I can think of where a meeting like that could have taken place without it being noticed and reported in some way in the international media. Anyway, the point is that Rubio says that the Americans found the Russians completely implacable, that they remained determined to stick to their positions, which were the ones that Putin outlined in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, and which the Russians have recently elaborated in the memorandum which they provided to the Ukrainians at the second meeting that took place between the Americans and the Russians in Istanbul, and which they further discussed at the follow-up meeting which took place in Istanbul a few weeks ago. I would remind people that Zelensky had up to that point shown intense reluctance to move forward with a third meeting. He'd made speeches and comments saying that a third meeting in Istanbul would serve no purpose, that the whole Istanbul process had run its course, and it was a genuine surprise when he suddenly announced that there would be such a meeting, and this happened directly after news appeared that the United States had vetoed the appointment of Ukraine's former defense minister, Rustem Umerov, to his post as ambassador, Ukraine's ambassador to Washington, and had apparently insisted that Umerov remain Ukraine's chief negotiator. And I also said that the fact that Umerov remained Ukraine's chief negotiator and the fact that Zelensky reversed his position and agreed to this further meeting in Istanbul, that could only have happened following pressure from the United States. And that, it seems to me, now explains the meeting, because the meeting took place. It took place in the same building as before. The Russians and the Ukrainians exchanged opinions about their respective memorandums, but it looks, at least this is my view, it looks as if this wasn't the real meeting which took place in Istanbul. The real meeting which took place in Istanbul was one in which the Americans met with the Russians and spoke to them and tried to find out whether there was any way forward. In other words, and this is the key thing, and it's the key takeaway from what Rubio is now saying, we have now entered into a situation again where there are direct negotiations between Russia and the United States about Ukraine. The negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which we see, the delegations turning up in Istanbul, the meetings in the great halls of the palaces there. These are for show. They are cover for the real discussions which are taking place, which are those between the Americans and the Russians. And this is an important fact, and it may become important later. But for the moment at least, the key thing is that the Russians proved implacable. They told the Americans over the course of these secret discussions the same things that they said to the Ukrainians in the public discussions, that Russia's position is the one set out in the memorandum that Russia sent to Ukraine, and which is based on the demands that Putin set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. Anyway, that was the one meeting. Rubio has told us about this. Now, Trump is telling us that there's going to be another meeting, only this time it's going to be in semi-public. And the person who's going to be conducting that meeting, who's going to meet with the Russians on behalf of the United States, is going to be Steve Witkoff again. I get the sense that at some level, Trump, after going along with Graham and going along with Graham and Kellogg, is now once again, as he realizes that the Russians are not going to back down, that they're not going to be intimidated by the threats that he's been making and which Graham has also been making. He's now reverting to the other line, the more conciliatory line, the one that Vance and Witkoff have been proposing, which is for some kind of engagement with Russia. So apparently Witkoff, a grotesquely overworked man, if I may say, somebody who does seem to have a genuine understanding of the conflict in Ukraine, but who is an amateur in diplomacy and who is not properly supported by a staff. He's still not National Security Advisor or anything like that. Anyway, he's supposed to be traveling to Europe, to Russia before very long. We're not told exactly which dates. We're not told whether these have been agreed by the Russians. But anyway, he is going to be traveling to Moscow to meet with the Russians all over again. I presume that this will happen before the 8th of August, when Trump's deadline runs out. And you could see again a sense of the desperation. The president doesn't want to start imposing tariffs and sanctions. He doesn't want to do what Lindsey Graham and Kellogg want him to do, but he's forced to do it. He's very angry that he has to do it. He's taking out some of his anger against Putin and the Russians. And he's trying again to send Witkoff to Moscow to see whether there's some way out of this situation into which he's got himself. Well, there it is. Maybe we shouldn't spend too much time worrying about Trump, because given that the Russians up to this point have shown no sign of making any fundamental concessions, I don't think that they're going to make any fundamental concessions before the 8th of June, the 8th of August. And for the record, Vladimir Putin has made further comments about the situation in Ukraine. As far as I can see, he's sticking to his positions. He continues to talk about the importance of addressing the root causes of the conflict, which means he's rejecting any idea of an unconditional ceasefire or a freezing of the conflict. He appears to be in a very confident mood. Now, as at this moment in time, I do not have a transcript or a readout of Putin's latest comments. They have apparently been made over the course of some kind of press conference which has taken place either in St. Petersburg or on the monastery island of Valam, where President Lukashenko of Belarus is meeting Putin. So I'm only getting fragments of what Putin has been saying. But suffice to say, Putin appears to be in an implacable mood. As I said, there's no sign that he's shifting ground. He's saying that the Russians, he's reported as saying, for example, that the Russians are not capturing territory in Ukraine. They're retaking territory which is their own. And he is saying this, and from what I can tell, he is saying this with respect to everywhere in Ukraine, not just Donbass or the four regions, but also Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, territory that is outside the four regions and which therefore, according to the Russians, is not actually a part of Russia. So anyway, I will return to what Putin is saying about the situation in my next program. Now, that brings me to the war itself, because though I think most of Trump's urgency relates to sanctions and tariffs and this web of tariffs and sanctions that he's propelled himself into, and his reluctance to start imposing them on the Russians and certainly on the Chinese and all of that, I think that part of it is also connected to the situation on the battlefronts. Now, one part of Putin's latest comments, which I am familiar with, is what Putin has been saying about Chasy Yar. Putin is saying that Chasy Yar was actually liberated several days ago, that the Russians held back reporting on the liberation of Chasy Yar until it was fully secured. Ukrainian denials, and we'll come to those in a moment, about the liberation of Chasy Yar shows how disconnected from reality the leadership in Kiev has become, and that nonetheless he does expect, and the Russians do expect, that there will be counterattacks by the Ukrainians trying to re-establish some ephemeral presence in Chasy Yar in order to make the denials, the Ukrainian denials that Chasy Yar has fallen, seem like truth. In other words, a repeat of what we saw earlier this year with Toretsk. After the Russians announced the capture of Toretsk, there were a whole series of Ukrainian counterattacks in and around Toretsk, raids, perhaps more accurately. The Ukrainians then claimed that fighting in Toretsk was still underway. The disputed Russian claims that Russians were in control of Toretsk. They got a whole big article about the Battle of Toretsk published by the Daily Telegraph in London, except of course that it was all ultimately PR. The Ukrainians were unable to hold their positions in Toretsk. As I said, their gains as a result from their counterattacks and their raids were entirely ephemeral, and nobody disputes any longer that Toretsk is indeed firmly under Russian control. Well, with respect to Chasy Yar, we now have abundant video footage which the Russians have provided, and this video footage clearly shows that the Russians do indeed control the whole of the metropolitan area of Chasy Yar. They are present in the center of Chasy Yar. They control the Yuzhny and Shevchenko micro-districts, there doesn't seem to be any part of Chasy Yar where the Russians are not present and where they are not in control. There may be Ukrainian stragglers and holdouts hiding in some parts of Chasy Yar. That is entirely plausible, but it is clearly the Russians who are currently in firm control. No doubt Putin is right. There will be Ukrainian counterattacks over the next days and weeks. But to repeat once more, it'll be a repeat of what happened in Toretsk. The Ukrainians may make some gains or may announce that they are present in some places in Chasy Yar. They may produce pictures of Ukrainian soldiers in parts of Chasy Yar and of those soldiers raising Ukrainian flags or doing those sort of things. But these will be ephemeral gains, like the gains that Ukraine is claiming and has perhaps made in Sumy region, in places like Kondratyevka, the village there. These gains are ephemeral and they are irrelevant to the overall course of the war. Now, that's what Putin has said. Chasy Yar clearly now under Russian control. The big battle, however, continues to be Pakovsk. And there's now been videos which the Ukrainians themselves have produced, which show the Ukrainians launching drone attacks on Russian positions. And these are clearly in the very center of Pakovsk. So, again, it's difficult to say exactly what the situation in Pakovsk is. But all the indications are, and all the information that we are getting suggests that there is actually fighting, probably intense fighting, going on inside Pakovsk itself. Now, this is where I come to what the Ukrainians are saying. So, Zelensky and his officials are denying that the Russians are in control of Chasy Yar. I've already discussed this. I've said what Putin has said, and I said that the video footage confirms that the Russians do control Chasy Yar. Zelensky is saying that all reports about the Russians having a presence within Pakovsk are wrong. Every so often, allegedly, this is according to Zelensky, Russian reconnaissance units sabotage and reconnaissance groups, to use the accepted terminology, infiltrate Pakovsk, but they are immediately detected by the Ukrainian defenders and destroyed. The Ukrainians, according to Zelensky, are holding on to all of their positions. The trouble is, this is not what the video footage is showing. I mean, if it was as simple as that, it would be difficult to understand why the Ukrainians are providing us with footage of drone attacks on Russian positions in the center of Pakrovsk. I am not sure how many Russian troops are there, how strong their positions are, whether the Russians have secure supply routes to their main forces, or whether their main forces have actually entered Pakrovsk. For the record, I believe that the main Russian forces have indeed entered Pakrovsk. Everything that I've heard seems to confirm that. But it seems clear to me from the Ukrainian footage that the situation in Pakrovsk is a great deal more serious than Zelensky is admitting. And of course that is consistent with the information from Chasy Yar. Zelensky, the Ukrainians, continue to claim that fighting is continuing in Chasy Yar, but we have conclusive evidence that the Russians are in firm control of all of it. Conclusive evidence from the video footage. Now, the situation in Pakovsk, in central Pakovsk, as I said, is up to some discussion. Even more complicated is trying to understand what is happening north of Pakovsk. Now, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Daily Telegraph appeared to confirm the reports that I discussed on the previous day, that the Russians are now located 10 kilometers away from the small town of Dobropilye, which is located to the northwest, some distance to the northwest of Pakrovsk. We've had more news today which does suggest that there is ongoing fighting for the village of Belitske, which is located on the highway that leads into Pakrovsk from the north. Last night, there were claims that Rodinske, the village to the south of Belitske, has been abandoned by the Ukrainians, that the Russians have in effect encircled Rodinske, that the Ukrainian defenders, in order to escape that encirclement, have fled, and that the village supposedly is now open for the Russians to take control of. I don't believe these reports. I remembered hearing similar reports about Yunakovka some weeks ago, that there were reports again from similar channels that the Ukrainians had abandoned the south of Yunakovka, that they were situated south of Yunakovka on slightly raised ground, but that the south of Yunakovka had been abandoned by the Ukrainians, this of course being a key village in Sumy region. I think that was largely true, but certainly not completely true. And I think that there are still Ukrainian troops in southern Yunakovka. And I don't believe that the Ukrainians have yet abandoned Rodinske. But it does seem that the Russians have indeed crossed the road leading to Pakrovsk from the north, and that the Ukrainian supply lines in Pakrovsk are becoming cut. There's been articles about the situation in CNN and other places, and they all talk about a disastrous situation in Pakrovsk. I spoke about this, the Daily Telegraph wrote about it as well. The same articles, the one in CNN, for example, also spoke about a rapidly deteriorating situation in Konstantinovka, much bigger place, a bigger place than Pakrovsk, located obviously to the east of Pakrovsk. It spoke about how one Ukrainian commander was complaining that his brigade had received no reinforcements for 8 months, and that the situation in Konstantinovka was going from bad to worse. And of course, the fall of Chasy Yar will make it worse still. Anyway, all the indications from Pakrovsk are of a tightening vice, of the pincers closing around Pakrovsk. The details may be sketchy, but the picture at least is clear. And importantly, yesterday we got the first reports that the Ukrainian authorities have now instructed the civilian population to leave Dobropilye and other villages to the north of Pakrovsk, which strongly suggests that they're all likely to be attacked and perhaps captured by the Russians at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. So there it is. Pakovsk all but encircled, the Western media effectively admitting that. Now, there's also been some admissions, this time from the Ukrainians, about the situation in another part of the battlefields, in Kupiansk. There's reports that, Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, has apparently adjusted its pictures about, its maps rather, showing territory around Kupiansk, which is either Russian-controlled or in the grey zone. It seems that it is now acknowledged that the Russians are indeed present in Kupiansk, but it seems the Deep State is now also showing only one supply route left for the Ukrainians to use, the Ukrainian garrison in Kupiansk to use, and it seems to be a small country road, inadequate for resupply. Just as the situation in Pakrovsk is looking extremely difficult for the Ukrainians, so it seems to me is the situation in Kupiansk itself. Now, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a series of claims that you find in the media in the West that the Russians have failed to capture any important place this year. They've only captured a few scattered villages and places of no importance. This is obviously not true. They captured Toretsk, an important town, an important fortified town. They've captured Suja in Kursk region. They've now captured Chasy Yar, town of 12,000 people and heavily fortified. By the way, the Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 7,500 men defending Chasy Yar. And some people are saying that this is a relatively small force for the Ukrainians. But Chasy Yar was a relatively small place, or rather is a relatively small place. Its total pre-war population was around 12,000. And as I pointed out in my program yesterday, the Russians never committed a big force to capture it. The force appears to have consisted almost entirely of the 98th Airborne Guards Division, a force of about 6,000 to 8,000 men in total. If you think of it in those terms, 7,500 men lost defending a place like Chasy Yar, to me, sounds like an awful lot. But anyway, I'm not going to get into this because I'm not sure how reliable these Russian casualty figures, these Russian figures for Ukrainian losses actually are. But anyway, to repeat again, the Russians have just captured Chasy Yar, and it looks like before long they're going to be capturing Pakrovsk and Kupiansk. Apparently, the Russians have made their first attempt to assault and break into Seversk, and it was unsuccessful, but it's likely that they will try again, as their position around that town is now becoming stronger. So, this narrative of the Russians failing to gain important places so far is already not true. But of course, when Pakrovsk falls, when the big towns in Donbass, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka fall, then it will no longer be arguable that this is going to happen is something that the Ukrainians themselves clearly understand. Now, in programs that we have done on the Duran and in comments I have made on this channel, we and I have discussed the fact that the Ukrainians are frantically trying to build a new defense line west of Donbass to try to hold back the Russians from advancing to the Dnieper. And we've now had a big article in the Wall Street Journal about it. And the article says that this is the biggest fortified line that has been created over the course of the Ukrainian war so far. And that, by the way, is absolutely not the case at all. The Ukrainian fortifications, even as the Wall Street Journal describes them, seem primitive compared to the Surovikin line, the enormous fortified line that the Russians created in Zaporozhye and Kherson region in the autumn and winter of 2022 and in the winter and spring of 2023. There is no sense here of the enormous minefields, the tremendous barriers of dragon's teeth and bunkers and pillboxes and anti-tank ditches that the Russians created, and which, by the way, have been explained best by Brian Beletic on the New Atlas. On the contrary, if you read the Wall Street Journal article closely, it all looks like an incredibly hurried, disorganized operation. There's references to barbed wire and trench lines being created. It's clear that the Ukrainians are trying to build a defense line. But apparently there's problems, there's references to shortages of materials, to disorganization caused by strikes. I'm not sure whether that means industrial action or Russian bombing and missile strikes. But anyway, a fortified line of some kind is being created. The key thing to understand about this fortified line is that it all but acknowledges the inevitable reality that the cities of Pakrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka are going to fall. The last big defense line anchored on cities is going to fall. And beyond that, until you reach the town of Pavlograd, it is open agricultural land without obvious defenses and without the great urban sprawl that has made advances in Donbass so difficult. So, I don't think this line is going to hold. The Russian Air Force can bomb it, something which, of course, the Ukrainians were never able to do at any scale in terms of the Surovikin line. I suspect that Donald Trump is being advised at some level about all of this. I'm not sure what information he's getting. I get the sense that the Pentagon, under Pete Hegseth, is as chaotic a place as every other part of his administration is, just saying. But I suspect that Trump, at some level at least, is aware of the looming crisis in the war and realizes that come the autumn, he's going to be looking at a critical military situation in Ukraine, that the pretense that Ukraine can resist the lava flow of the Russian advance, that the war is in some way in stalemate, that the Russian offensive has been a failure, that narrative line will have become exhausted. What Donald Trump intends to do about it, I have no idea. But I suspect that these meetings between the Americans and the Russians that Rubio was talking about, and the dispatch of Witkoff to Moscow, is to some extent at least as much about this reality unfolding on the battlefields as it is about the tariffs and the sanctions and the various deadlines that Trump has basically imposed on himself. So anyway, there we are. Now, in the meantime, as all of this plays out, Zelensky, of course, continues to cling on in Ukraine. There is criticism of him. There seems to be some acknowledgement that his political position there is weaker than it was. I think the more important fact is not what the political games in Ukraine, in Kiev, are telling us about the situation, but the fact that the Americans and the Russians are once more in direct discussion about the conflict in Ukraine, that they are negotiating directly with each other. That's essentially what Rubio has told us, and I suspect it's what Witkoff has been trying to, what Trump is trying to do by sending Witkoff to Moscow again. Now, I've always believed that if there was going to be a diplomatic settlement to this war, it could only be done through direct negotiations between Washington and Moscow. I remember that some months ago, Anatol Lieven, one of the most insightful of commentators, wrote in Responsible Statecraft, the website, the indispensable website of the Quincy Institute, that the way to end the war would be through direct negotiations between the Americans and the Russians. And given that the Ukrainians were going to be a disruptive element in such negotiations, that the Americans should try to keep the Ukrainians away. I wish that advice had been heeded when it was given. This is a conflict not between Russia and Ukraine ultimately. As Lavrov and other Russian officials have said, it is a conflict between Russia and the United States, and ultimately between Russia and the collective West, and between Russia and NATO. After all, the New York Times told us some months ago about the extent to which U.S. military commanders were basically running the war and had basically been in control of the Ukrainian army during Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. The extent of American micromanagement of the war, and the London Times has told us the same about the extent of British micromanagement of parts of the war. So, given that this is so, given that this is the reality, and Rubio himself, the US Secretary of State, has admitted, has referred to the conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war between Russia and the United States, it seems that there is every reason and entirely legitimate grounds to conduct it, to end it, through a direct negotiation between Washington and Moscow. The huge mistake that was made earlier this year, the one which I suspect Kellogg played a role in leading the administration onto, was refusing to acknowledge that, insisting that it was the Ukrainians who were the main party to the war that was being fought with the Russians, and trying to use the Ukrainians as the main interlocutor of the Russians and to try to seek a negotiated end to the war on terms that the Ukrainians could be persuaded to accept. In other words, doing exactly the thing that Anatol Lieven warned against. Well, perhaps, just possibly, over the next few months, when the Donbass cities fall, with the Americans and the Russians talking to each other again, we might move beyond that, and that era might be put behind us, and we could get a more substantive negotiation taking place. But I have to say, to me, all this looks too late now. What might have been possible in the spring may no longer be possible in the autumn. If the Russians are broken through, if the Donbass is falling, if the Russians feel confident that they're going to break through to the Dnieper, why would they agree to talk? What would there be left to talk about? And if there were talks, I can't imagine that the Russian terms would be anything like as reasonable as they might have been in the spring, and if the Europeans and Lindsey Graham and Keith Kellogg and all the others were not prepared to accept those Russian terms when they were proposed in the spring, how much less likely is it going to be that they will accept the much harsher Russian terms that could be presented in the autumn? So I'm afraid, I think that in terms of the war in Ukraine, the possibility of negotiations has now been irretrievably lost. The best that one can expect, or perhaps might hope for, is some sort of understanding between the Americans and the Russians, which might avoid some further clash in Europe, for which, to be clear, there is a very distinct need. Now, I say that because yesterday, Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the former secretary of Russia's Security Council, in other words, Putin's national security advisor, but now the head of the Maritime Union, the man, in other words, who is in charge of Russian naval construction and merchant navy construction, who is therefore in overall charge of Russia's ship policies, its, if you like, sea and naval and ocean policies. He has now made some extremely concerning comments about the situation in the Baltic. He says that NATO is now starting to hunt merchant shipping in the Baltic, which is trading with Russia, that NATO is working to sabotage ships that trade with Russia, that underwater drones and other types of equipment is being created to allow plausible deniability, so that if ships are blown up and sink, the NATO powers can pretend that it isn't them. And, well, he is ringing the alarm. Now, this is the man who, it seems to me, is now in practice in overall charge of the Russian Navy. He's been, in fact, by the way, on that point, very much at center stage, because over the last couple of weeks, Putin has been leading a whole succession of meetings about the development of the Russian Navy, at which Patrushev has been the main speaker and interlocutor. I'll say very briefly here that it seems to me that the Russian Navy has gradually started to recover since about 2010. The Russians have been fairly successful in rebuilding their submarine forces. They've built large numbers of rather advanced conventional submarines and very advanced nuclear submarines of the Yasen and Bore class. They've also started production of a new class of missile frigates, and they've also developed various corvettes and other things. But in some respects, their naval programs have been muddled. Large sums of money have been squandered in what have turned out to be relatively unsuccessful programs to try to update older warships rather than invest in new construction. And Patrushev, who has a background in naval engineering, anyway, he seems to have been brought in to try and sort out the mess and to give coherence and structure to this naval program. But anyway, the important thing is that when he says that there is this crisis beginning to develop in the Baltic, Putin is certainly going to pay attention to it. And I suspect that over the next couple of weeks, we are going to see a major uptick in the Russian military presence in the Baltic. The Russians will probably start to move more naval assets there. They can do so, by the way, by sending missile craft through the various rivers and canals that link up cities like St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region with other parts of Russia. They can presumably also send warships into the Baltic from the Arctic, their Arctic bases, and they will probably start to build up their drone and missile presence as well. And of course, to repeat again, this is the month where it's likely that we're going to start to see systems like the Oreshnik missile come into large-scale operation. So there is a crisis in the Baltic starting to develop. We had those extraordinary reckless comments by General Donahue about a week ago, talking about how NATO would be able to capture Kaliningrad in short order. There is, as I said, a sense of crisis starting to develop around the Baltic. And as the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, all the indications are that that crisis might escalate to extremely dangerous levels. So if the Americans and the Russians can start speaking to each other, even if they can't agree to anything substantive about Ukraine, but can find some way to de-escalate tensions in the Baltic, for example, that would be a good thing. Just saying. And if the Russians and the Americans can perhaps, over time, start to discuss, shall we call them confidence-building measures relating to Ukraine. So let's say the Russians cross the river, the Dnieper, occupy big stretches of central and western Ukraine, perhaps occupy the whole of Ukraine. This is increasingly being talked about in Russia now, that the Russian forces that will be stationed in Ukraine will be held to a certain limit, enabling the United States to hold down the limit of the forces that it deploys in response. Those kind of things. Well, that would not be a bad thing. And if we start getting more and more missiles, hypersonic missiles, like the Oreshnik and the new hypersonic missiles that the United States is developing, if we start to see those also starting to appear, again, a dialogue between the Americans and the Russians about that becomes more important still. So, dialogue between the Americans and the Russians is a good thing. But to repeat again, I think it's come too late for Ukraine. Now, one other area where there might be some scope for a dialogue between the Americans and the Russians could conceivably be the Middle East. Now, a couple of days ago, Putin and Netanyahu had a telephone conversation. The Russians have provided a readout. They're not saying who it was who initiated this conversation, but it is interesting. And the readout doesn't tell us very much. I'm going to read it out. The two leaders discussed various aspects of the tense situation in the Middle East. Various aspects of the tense situation in the Middle East. There are so many aspects. There's Gaza, the horrors that are playing out there. There's the conflict with Iran. Anyway, the Russian side has reiterated its unwavering support of resolving the problems and conflicts arising in the region exclusively via peaceful means. So that's a way of saying that Putin told Netanyahu, we do not agree with what you're doing. We do not agree with what you did to Iran, what you're doing in Gaza, what you're doing in the West Bank, and what you're doing in Syria. But importantly, many of the topics, many of the aspects which Netanyahu and Putin undoubtedly did discuss aren't mentioned in this readout. Anyway, the readout then goes on to say, in particular, Vladimir Putin emphasized the importance of supporting the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic and reinforcing its internal political stability by respecting the legitimate rights and interests of all ethnic and confessional communities. So that's a complicated way of saying that, yes, Russia is worried about the Druze and what's being done to them, and about the Christians and the Alawites, but it doesn't want Israel involved in Syria. The Israelis need to respect Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that Russia doesn't approve of the actions that Israel is taking there. And there's been a follow-up to that, because over the last couple of days, al-Jilani's defense and foreign ministers have visited Moscow, and they've had talks with the Russians. And again, we are not being told the subject of those talks, at least not in any detail, but the Russian readouts suggest that the representatives of what is now the internationally recognized Syrian government, in other words, Jilani's government, are asking Russia for military assistance. They're asking, in effect, the Russians to come back to Syria and to help to rebuild the Syrian armed forces. What the Russians said in response, I don't know. But we could see that the pressures that al-Jilani is under are causing him to turn to the Russians as well. Anyway, the readout of the conversation between Putin and Netanyahu continues. In light of the recent escalation between Iran and Israel, the Russian side expressed its willingness to facilitate in every possible way the search for negotiated solutions to the Iran nuclear issue. So the Russians again saying that they're prepared to provide help, but notice again, facilitate in every possible way. Every possible way. That means that they're prepared to be more than just mediators, for example. Again, it doesn't exclude, it far from excludes, providing military assistance to Iran, which I think is coming. And then the readout finishes. The two leaders agreed to continue their dialogue on pressing international and bilateral matters. So Netanyahu and Putin do understand that they have to stay in touch. There is no reference to Gaza in this readout. And I'm going to suggest that the reason for that probably is that this discussion became very heated and the Russians don't want to reveal that in this readout. Anyway, the point is that the Russians are playing a role in the Middle East, and the Americans at some point may decide that it is wise for them to coordinate with the Russians about that. It would be wise of the Americans to do this. Of course, that assumes wisdom in Washington, which might not exist. But if the Russians are a player in the Middle East, how realistically can the United States ignore it? Anyway, we will see. It looks as if the pendulum is starting to shift again. The Americans talking about negotiations, even as we move towards the now inevitable countdown towards tariffs and sanctions. I think the Russians are treating this with total cynicism. I think they have no expectations that anything will come of it. But, as always, they're prepared to talk. What comes of those talks will depend entirely on what the Americans choose to do. Anyway, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.